Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Federalist Files. We're going to be going over Federalist number 28. It is titled, "The Same Subject Continued, the Idea of Restraining the Legislative Authority in Regard to the Common Defense Considered," written by Alexander Hamilton, written or released on December 26th, 1787. Topics include more to fear from the state usurpations and then federal usurpations. The strength of the people surpasses that of the government, and checks and balances between federal and state governments. So this paper is almost like a precursor to Federalist number 29. Federalist number 29 is one of the most profound of the Federalist Papers. It is most referenced in terms of Second Amendment usage. This is kind of a precursor to that. It gives a little bit of information in terms of how the power should fall upon the people to be able to battle against their government. So to begin this paper, Hamilton acknowledges that in some cases the national government must necessitate force when it cannot be denied. One of the functions of the national government is that they must be able to quell insurrections. So Hamilton asserts, and I quote, "Should such emergencies at any time happen under the national government, there could be no remedy but force. The means to be employed must be proportioned to the extent of the mischief." End quote. So here in the very beginning, he's talking about his objectors are trying to confound, saying that you'll have to use force. The proposed constitution is going to be illegitimate because you're going to have to use force to enforce the law. In some cases, there really is no other option. In certain cases, like insurrections, like revolts, there will have to be force to enforce the law. Now, in other aspects, in terms of taxation, you can go through the judicial branch. There's criminal courts as well as civil courts, and that's really what the proposed constitution ended up. The Constitution, in and of itself, instilled a judicial branch, thus mitigating these more violent scenarios. That's why it's kind of weird. It's weird coming from the dissenters that extolled the Articles of Confederation, because at that time they did not have anything set up to handle those type of situations, any type of encroachments or any type of violations of law. They did not have a system set up federally to remedy that. Usually it was just always force, and that's why it's weird coming from the objectors. So in the case of small commotions in a small part of an individual state, the residential militia shall suppress the insurrection. The national government will stand by ready to help. In the case of a larger, more extraordinary insurrection, the national government shall handle the situation. So that's what Hamilton says in this, and he states it here, and I quote, "If it should be a slight commotion in a small part of a state, the militia of the residue would be adequate to its suppression, and the national presumption is that they would be ready to do their duty. An insurrection, whatever may be its immediate cause, eventually endangers all government." End quote. So any type of insurrection, any type of chaos or instability in a system will, in essence, eventually endanger a government system as well as the people themselves at large. It'll endanger or jeopardize the safety of the people, thus jeopardizing the government, because this government is supposed to be derived from the people. It's self-government. So Hamilton remarks, and I quote, "Regard to the public peace, if not the rights of the Union, would engage the citizen to whom the contagion had not communicated itself to oppose the insurgents, and if the general government should be found in practice conducive to the prosperity and the felicity of the people, it were rational to believe that they would be disinclined to its support." End quote. So he's saying anything that is going to cause any type of instability in the Union, if the Union or the national government structure is not going to support the militia or support with military force themselves, then essentially it's really not like having a federal, it's not a federal government. They should be inclined, they should have a propensity to support those state governments. or those state militias with a federal military. So then he goes on to state, and I quote, if on the contrary the insurrection should pervade a whole state or a principal part of it, the employment of a different kind of force might become unavoidable, end quote. So that's really the part where he is addressing his objectors that are saying, oh, there's always going to have to be a use of force coming from the federal government. And what Hamilton's saying is, no, there won't have to be, but if an insurrection or revolt gets so large, then yes, a different kind of force will become unavoidable, as in the federal government will have to get involved with their national military. So then Hamilton goes on, he cites Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York. They all have separate provisions, or they have enacted policy to raise troops. And pretty much he says, why is it that those states can do that? And I think New York actually did it in a scenario to fight over some land with Vermont, I'm pretty sure, from what he says. And then Massachusetts was the Shays Rebellion. And then Pennsylvania, there was a scenario there where in their constitution it says they ought not to raise troops, but still they hold troops and they raise them. So he's saying, why is it that you guys are confounding this principle and misinterpreting it almost, and you're also hypocritical. You're saying, why is it that Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, and you have all these other states that are in this United States, you have all these 13 other states that are doing the same thing, but why can't the federal government do that? He continues, if it must then be admitted that the necessity of recurring to a force different from the militia in cases of this extraordinary nature is applicable to the state governments themselves, why should the possibility that the national government might be under a like necessity in similar extremities be made an objection to its existence, end quote. So there he's saying that why is it that the state governments themselves are able to have these militias and these military set up, but then the national government is unable to do that even in the most extreme circumstances. And then he goes on to state, and I quote, is it not surprising that men who declare an attachment to the Union in the abstract should urge as an objection to the proposed Constitution what applies with tenfold weight to the plan for which they contend, end quote. So he's saying that the plan for which they stand on the side of, the one that they're contending, and they praise the idea of the Articles of Confederation or the state government powers, these things that they praise and they extol, these values and these virtues, are okay when they're in the state or when they're in the Articles of Confederation, but it's not okay when those same powers are laid in the federal government. So Hamilton goes on to list a hypothetical scenario pursuing the system proposed by his dissenters of multiple confederacies rather than a union, and this is very critical here. He goes on to explain pretty much that if you had 3 or 4 separate confederacies like the anti-federalists wanted, that there still will be use of a general government or military forces that are raised up by governments, whether it's the state government or the federal government, and it'll cause mutual jealousies and more infighting. So he explains this, and I quote, would not each of them be exposed to the same casualties, and when these happen, be obliged to have recourse to the same expedients for upholding its authority, which are objected to in a government for all the states? Would the militia in this supposition be more ready or more able to support the federal authority than in the case of a general union, end quote. Yeah, so he's just saying, are we trying to, having this 4 Confederate states set up, who's to say that there's not going to be force there, even in a confederacy like that? If they consider to hold on to an Articles of Confederation, the militia may actually take the side. Certain militiamen may take the side of the federal government. So really, no matter what you get, you're going to get a standing force from a general or federal government. It's going to happen no matter what. And then if you're not going to have that, then you're going to have the state governments with powers like that, which will actually cause more instability. And then he goes on to state, and I quote, all candid and intelligent men must upon due consideration acknowledge that the principle of the objection is equally applicable to either of the two cases, and that whether we have one government for all the states or different governments for different parcels of them, or even if there should be an entire separation of the states, there might sometimes be a necessity to make use of a force constituted differently from the militia to preserve the peace of the community and to maintain the just authority of the laws against those violent invasions of them which amount to insurrections and rebellions, end quote. So really and this is exactly, he's harping on what I've been saying, but just to add another element to this. Now, if you're going to need, when he says you're going to need to make a force that's constituted differently from the militia, he means an actual organized military. So let's say you have New York and you have New Jersey and you have Pennsylvania. They're all very close to each other. They're all adjacent. Now, what you have is let's say, New York and New Jersey are fighting each other. It needs to be quelled. You don't have a federal government system. You don't have the standing military from the federal government to help, because this is under the Articles of Confederation, where they were unable to raise troops. Pennsylvania will do, because they see this entire situation themselves. They see themselves and their safety in jeopardy, so they will take sides with one of the states, or they will just conquer both of the states at the same time. So either way, having a military or having a militia in these individual states, there'll still be battles over this, no matter what. And somebody will always have to put down the insurrection or the rebellion and maintain order and keep that order. And once that person does hold order or maintain the order, now they can be brought up to this position of power. And that was something that actually happened right after the Revolutionary War with George Washington, when they won the Revolution. And then George Washington, I think it was right before he became the president. I think it was King George, or it was after. I think it might have been after his term. But to begin with, what happened was George Washington he was this saint amongst the people. He was praised. He was idolized because of his expertise on the battlefield as General Washington. And this was before he was the president, obviously. He was the head general of the Continental Army. They won their battles. They gained their independence, the United States. And at that time, if George Washington really wanted to, he could have easily became the king of the United States. He could have became the king. They could have set up some sort of government structure that had some sort of monarchical system, and he could have held the power, or he could have at least attempted. There was not even an attempt. There was no rumblings of it. There was no thought of it that went through George Washington's head at that time. So then what happened is, over the years, they let them do this whole Articles of Confederation thing. They did it for about, 11 years. They get the Constitution thrown in there. And he waits, he wins the presidency, the first and then the second. And at this time, there was no term limits. Now, ever since FDR, now it's a term limit of 2, because FDR held the presidency for like 16 years. He had four different term limits in a row. So now, as president of the United States, you can only hold 2 term limits. So what we had George Washington was in there. He did 2 terms and he stepped down. When he had all the power in his hands, he had everything. He had the entire country in his hands, because people had such a loyalty to General Washington or President Washington because of his battle expertise, and that he was just such a true patriot. He was representative of America. And he stepped down from the power when he had all of it. He had America in his clutches. He could have really done almost anything with the support of the people, because he also is the only president to ever win as an independent as well. So he had the support from both the left and the right at that time. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. But now they weren't the left and the right. They were really like the right, and then like the far right. So he stepped down from his president seat. And King George said, when he heard news of it, King George, the King of England at the time, he said that he may be the greatest man. If that's true, he may be the greatest man that's ever lived. Just because he had everything, and he decided to give it all up because he didn't care about the power. Was meaningless. After he defeated one of the strongest militaries at the time, the strongest military in the world, then he goes on to become the president, holding power there, and then he steps away from all of it, and he lets the country run itself. So it was a highly admirable thing that he did. Now, yeah. So next, Hamilton, I don't even remember what I was talking about, the fact that I brought that all up, but I just thought it'd be interesting to share that with everybody. So next, Hamilton answers the objections of those dissenters of military establishments. He states, and I quote, "Independent of all other reasonings upon the subject, it is a full answer to those who require a more preemptory provision against military establishments in time of peace, to say that the whole power of the proposed government is to be in the hands of the representatives of the people. This is the essential and, after all, only efficacious security for the rights and privileges of the people, which is attainable in civil society." Now, what he's saying is the power of the military establishment should be in the hands of the representatives of the people, as in the House of Reps, and then I guess the senators as well, but more the House of Reps because they hold the purse. They really do hold the ultimate power on how big a military establishment gets, and he believed this was essential. And I think this also, if even his dissenters on this one probably agreed with him, if we were to have military establishments, it should be in the hands of the House of Representatives or of the Congress, because they are direct representations of the people. Now, it is, and like you said, it is essential for the security of the rights and the privileges of the people, and this is where we're going to get to how the state government, as well as having the state and the federal government, are kind of safeguards against each other, from their checks and balances against each other, for making sure one doesn't usurp and take the rights away from the people, and vice versa. So this will work as a safeguard against usurpations from the federal government. And Hamilton states, and I quote, "If the representatives of the people betray their constituents, there is then no resource left but in the exertion of that original right of self-defense which is paramount to all positive forms of government, and which against the usurpations of the national rulers may be exerted with infinitely better prospect of success than against those of the rulers of an individual state," end quote. So this is awesome here. This is the inherent right to self-defense that he's alluding to here, the original right of self-defense, which is paramount to all positive forms of government. So meaning the individual's right to self-defense, the people, considering this is a self-government structure, their right to self-defense against usurpations from federal representatives is paramount. It is above, on the list of priorities, it is above that of the federal government or the representatives. So if these representatives betray their constituents, they go for a usurpation of power, they try to encroach the private rights of the citizenry, the people themselves have their own right, their own basic right to a self-defense against this government usurpation. And then he goes on to explain Hamilton, and he says there's infinitely better prospect of success than against those who are rulers of an individual state. So national rulers, it's much easier to usurp or to counteract or counterattack their usurpations rather than a individual state government, and I'll explain why. So in this excerpt, Hamilton identifies the inherent right to self-defense by the people against an oppressive government. Hamilton begins to make the argument that the people have more to fear from the state as usurpers rather than the national government. So that is important, that this is kind of, that's why I said this was kind of the opening, or the opening of the Second Amendment in this one, and then the next one's the huge Second Amendment paper, the Federalist number 29. So he continues here, and I quote, "In a single state, if the persons entrusted with supreme power become usurpers, the different parcels, subdivisions, or districts of which it consists, having no distinct government in each, can take no regular measures for defense. The citizens must rush tumultuously to arms, without concert, without system, without resource, except in their courage and despair. The usurpers, clothed with the forms of legal authority, can too often crush the opposition nation in embryo, end quote. So this is the difference between the federal government and the state government. So the federal government, they have, let's say they have their military, they have their establishment, right? But then in each individual state government, the states actually have their rights to hold their own state militia, not their own like big state military structure, but some sort of at least somewhat organized militia that may have some sort of rudimentary training and may be unified in a certain specific way, may have some sort of familiarity with military operations. So if this usurping or if this encroachment is coming from the state government is also in charge of setting up the militia structure. So then there's no one to set up. There's no one to set up any type of regulation, any type of defensive force, really. So the single state can take rights away from the citizens, and the citizens have to rush tumultuously or chaotically to arms without concert, meaning without any type of plans, without any type of system, no apparatus, no protocol, without resource, meaning without having any type of revenue coming in from the people to get those arms, so that you're using their own personal wealth to try to purchase up arms to defend themselves. And the only thing that they would have is their courage and despair from the state government structure. So then Hamilton asserts, and I quote, "The smaller the extent of the territory, the more difficult will it be for the people to form a regular or systematic plan of opposition, and the more easy will it be to defeat their early efforts. Intelligence can be more speedily obtained of their preparations and movements, and the military force in the possession of the usurpers can be more rapidly directed against the part where the opposition has begun," end quote. So if really having that smaller extent of territory, like a state like New Jersey, if the state governor wants to go for a full-on gun grab or gun confiscation, because it is a smaller extent of territory, it is much easier to shut down little insurrections here and there because there's less time to travel and distance from one place to the next. And then on top of that, for information to be obtained at this time, since it was, like horse and buggy to get information out there, to obtain some information if you're living in Middlesex County to go into Somerset County, it's not gonna take as long. Maybe it'll take a day worth of travel at this time, rather than, it's not like there was email, so it's not like if there's some sort of revolt going on in New Jersey, and then suddenly now there's also a revolt going on in Georgia. To get information from New Jersey to Georgia could take maybe weeks or months to get the information there at this time. So that's why it's easier if it's a smaller extent of territory. And then also, if you are the state government, and this is something that no one probably even thinks about just on a basic level sense, if you're the state government, you're more inclined to have the knowledge of the geographical layout of the state of New Jersey, so you would kind of be able to understand where things are going from a logistics perspective. You would be able to understand what is going on. If there's a revolt in this area, then there's one here, and you kind of know how to set up your militia or your military to suppress the insurrections in that state. Whereas if it's the federal government, how are they supposed to really be familiar with the territories in every single state? They're not going to be. That's part of the reason why FEMA comes in when there is these federal disasters. They call them the Federal Emergency and Management Administration. And really what FEMA should do, they should just give the money and give the people to these states and just let the states run it themselves, because the state government should know how to handle their own local operations better than a federal government head that's not even from the area. So that's the reason, that is Hamilton's making that point, that the smaller extent of the military of the territory, it's easier to run military operations, and intelligence will be more speedily obtained because of this. So then he continues, and I quote, "The obstacles of usurpation and the facilities of resistance increased with the increased extent of the state, provided the citizens understand their rights and are disposed to defend them." So it gets harder and harder. The larger the extent of land gets, the harder it is to keep a boot on the neck of the citizenry, and this would apply as well to the British Empire. It would also apply to the Roman Empire, the ancient Roman Empire, the Greek Empire. The larger and larger it gets, it seems like the more the more chaotic or the more revolting that goes on, it becomes more unstable, and it's harder to hold a stability in all those areas and suppress all of that, those factions and the violence and the chaos. So then Hamilton argues that the power of the people over the national government is much stronger than the power they have over their state governments because of the extent of land and population. He goes on, and I quote, "The natural state strength of the people in a large community in proportion to the artificial strength of the government is greater than in a small, and of course more competent to a struggle with the attempts of the government to establish a tyranny." So he's saying the natural strength of the people, and the federal government structure almost, and he is right when he says this, even today it applies. The strength of the federal government is really artificial. Now, their military structure apparatus, I don't know how many established military members they really have, but it's nowhere near the population of the people in the United States. Let's see if I can look up active military. And that's really the point that he's trying to make. He's trying to make... See, I'm trying to look up how many. I think it's probably a couple million if I had to guess. It's not a lot, though. It's a very small percentage. Okay, so we have... And this is when people complain about the military. I understand the military spending sometimes. It is a huge amount of the budget. But if we're talking about self-preservation, and we're talking about something that is in the Constitution, specifically, there's provisions, it is one thing the government is actually in charge of. That's one of the last things we should be complaining about. In terms of constitutionality, I know the libertarians like to kind of complain about. It's weird. The libertarians are kind of all over the place, it seems like. From people that I know that are libertarians, from what they put out there, it seems like they're kind of all over the place. I don't really know if they are actually libertarians, to be honest with you. So, if this stands correctly here, available manpower, fit for service, reaching military age, reserve. Okay, so active personnel. So total military personnel is 2.26. So 2,260,000. That's total military personnel. Active, we have 1.4 million. And reserve, so the active and the reserve put together makes it 2.26 million. Now, available people that we really have if we were to enact this, the draft, would be 144 million. So it's a lot of people because our total population is 330 million. So we're looking at, in terms of total military personnel, including active as well as reserve, 0.7. So 7/10 of 1 percentage point is how much our military makes up. So the people themselves far surpass our military forces in this country if there was ever to be an oppressive government that wants to hold it down and keep us inside of our houses. They would be unable to do it on a widespread or a pervasive manner. It would just be, it's insurmountable. It would be impossible for them to do something like that. Now, and this is exactly what Hamilton's alluding to. The people are still going to hold the power. They're stronger than the national government. Now, the state government will actually be harder to hold down because it's less people in a smaller area. Now, this is if the federal government were to try to go for full on, just, I guess, shutdown, and they put all their military in the streets. Like I said, they'll have about 2.26 million. It sounds like a lot, but then when you have to look over 330 million people, and then you would also have to, I guess you would have to mobilize all the federal law enforcement agencies, like the FBI, the ATF, maybe CIA, but I don't even think they would send the CIA in there. The Department of Homeland Security would probably be one. Border Patrol, all them. It's just it is nonsensical. It would not work. It is a fallacious argument, really, or it's a fallacious ideology to think that they can actually come in here and overthrow the people. It really works the other way around. If the people were actually unified, if you think about, so 0.7, so 7/10 of a percentage point, that is our military. So in this country, really, to overthrow the government, if you wanted to, or at least fight back against some sort of government oppression, you would maybe only need probably 10% of the people, because 10% of the people would be, 33 million, essentially. 33 million versus 2.26 million. Yeah, you would need, I don't know how much exactly, but 10% I think would be plenty. That'd be fine. So Hamilton, then he continues. He concludes this paper with the check and balance that shall persist between the general government and of that of the state, stating, and I quote, "The general government will at all times stand ready to check the usurpations of the state governments, and these will have the same disposition toward the general government." So the state's going to be a check on the general government, and the general government will be a check on the state government. And he continues, and I quote, "But in a confederacy, the people, without exaggeration, may be said to be entirely the masters of their own fate, power being almost always the rival of power. The general government will at all times stand ready to check the usurpations of the state governments, and these will have the same disposition toward the general government." Oh, that's something that I stated before. Yeah, and then he talks about a confederacy. I don't know exactly if he's talking about the current Articles of Confederation, meaning power will always be rivaled by power. If he's just saying in a general sense that this power will rival the other one just to keep each other in line or in check. Then he continues, and I quote, "If their rights are invaded by either, they can make use of the other as the instrument of redress. How wise will it be in them by cherishing the union to preserve to themselves an advantage which can never be too highly prized," end quote. So having this union, what he's saying is how cherishing the union to preserve themselves. So the people, by having this union, really, the people have everything to gain from the union. The state governments and the federal governments really don't have much to gain from the establishment of this union, but the people do themselves, because in order to preserve their freedoms, preserve their private rights as citizens, they have the redress of both the federal government as well as the state government as a remedy to kind of fight against each other to hold and sustain their rights and ensure them as well. So then he goes on to explain, and I quote, "It may safely be received as an axiom in our political system that the state governments will, in all possible contingencies, afford complete security against invasions of the public liberty by the national authority. Projects of usurpation cannot be masked under pretenses so likely to escape the penetration of select bodies of men as of the people at large." So if these, and this is something that I'm not sure exactly if this applies today, but he's saying projects from the federal government or even from the state government to usurp their power cannot be masked under pretenses so likely to escape the penetration of select bodies of men as of the people at large. So what we're seeing right now in these states, some individual states, there's usurpations by their state governors, and this gets to the broader point of what Hamilton said. Actually, there really is more to worry about from the state government than there is the federal. Because if you look right now, and I don't know if it has anything to do with party politics right now, but if you look from the federal government, we are not seeing federal government restrictions coming down the pike at all. Maybe in a Biden administration, maybe we will see some sort of mandatory mask mandate. It will not be followed. There will be civil disobedience. People will not follow wearing a mask outside in the middle of their neighborhood when no one else is out there. No one's it's nonsensical. It's ridiculous. There is no study to support the usage of that outside in the open. Now, this is something. So the state governments, especially in New Jersey in particular, what's the other ones? Michigan with Whitmer. I think Oregon's really bad. Oregon, they're telling you to tell on your neighbors if they're doing something wrong. I mean, there's all, in New York as well. They shut down all these businesses as well as the eateries, the restaurants. They force them, really all they can do is take out at this point. In I believe that's in New York, as well as that's also in certain parts of California, particularly in LA. They're doing that. So right now the usurpations are coming all from the state government. And the federal government really is not making... That's what's really weird about the left, and they make Trump out to be. Like, the guy that they make Trump, they envision him to be, is this tyrant, this authoritarian. And it seems like he's letting the states practice their own sovereignty, even if the state's sovereignty is actually a violation of constitutional rights of the individual of the people themselves by infringing on the rights of the people, and then also there has been no legislative action, so there's been no laws actually passed. They mostly, I don't even know of one that isn't actually passed other than like everything's been passed through executive order, which is not technically law. That's just like mandate. It's pretty much BS. It's like a reference. Like, oh, maybe you should do this. That's really what you should do with an executive order. You should wipe your butt with it. You should treat it like toilet paper. But so nothing has been actually passed through law, and this has all been executive orders straight down the pike. And what they make Trump out to be, the left, you would think that Trump would do something to ensure the rights of the citizens and ensure the rights of freedom of property and being able to run your business freely in the United States. You would think that that would be something that Trump would do, considering the way in which he's been characterized by the left in the media. But you know what I say? I say that I think Matt Walsh was tweeting it the other day. Is, you know what we should do? The next person that should be elected out of the Republican Party should truly be what they make them out to be. Because Trump is not what they make him out to be in terms of those type of things. He generally lets the states, he kind of keeps a hands-off approach. He lets the states do as they will. But there are certain times I think the federal government should be stepping in and allowing people the freest option possible. Now, yeah, so then he continues here. And I quote, "The legislatures will have better means of information. They can discover the danger at a distance, and possessing all the organs of civil power and the confidence of the people, they can at once adopt a regular plan of opposition in which they can combine all the resources of the community. They can readily communicate with each other in the different states and unite their common forces for the protection of their common liberty," end quote. So here what he's saying is the legislatures, I don't know if he means actually the state legislatures or I guess maybe he means the House of Representatives, because he says the penetration select bodies of men as of the people of large. Yeah, that makes sense. So he's probably talking about the House of Representatives, the legislatures, maybe of the individual states. They will always be informed to exactly what the federal government or the state government is doing, and they will go inform the people. They are possessing the organs of civil power in their own state governments. So the state legislatures, I think that's really what he's referring to, because it makes more sense to each other in the different states. Yeah, so the state legislature, he says the organs of civil power, meaning they really hold the purse, the state legislatures, so they can appropriate funds as they see necessary, to fight the danger coming from the federal government. They can readily communicate with different states and unite their common forces for the protection of their common liberties. So I think the federal government really does have more to actually worry from the state than the state does the federal government in a lot of ways. Now, nowadays, I don't know exactly, because the federal government just has, their apparatus is so huge, and their scope is so large, and they have so much funding from the American people because they have the purse of 330 million people. So I don't exactly know there, but in terms, if the state governments really did a good job, the people would stand with them and be loyal to the state governments, which I'm not loyal to the state government because they do a horrible job in New Jersey. So Hamilton stresses, and I quote, "The great extent of the country is a further security. We have already experienced its utility against the attacks of a foreign power, and it would have precisely the same effect against the enterprises of ambitious rulers in the national councils." When he says the national councils, he means the national legislature or the federal government legislature, Congress, the House of Representatives, and the senators. And he'll explain why. Now, Hamilton cites the recent revolution as an example that a general government is unable to quell the resistance of an entire country, because once one insurrection is quelled, another is started in a distant state. So then he goes on to explain this, and I quote, "If the federal army should be able to quell the resistance of one state, the distant states would have it in their power to make head with fresh forces. The advantages obtained in one place must be abandoned to subdue the opposition in others, and the moment of the part which had been reduced to submission was left to itself, its efforts would be renewed and its resistance revive." End quote. So here what he's saying, the federal government, if there's some sort of insurrection in Pennsylvania, in western Pennsylvania, they quell the insurrection, they're winning the battle, and then now look, an insurrection now starts up in New Jersey on the opposing side. Now in New Jersey, they're crossing over the Hudson River to come fight the federal forces that are pinning down Pennsylvanians in the west and western Pennsylvania. So then the federal force is going to have to turn around to fight the New Jerseyans, and then look, all the battles that they were winning in Pennsylvania don't matter now because the Pennsylvania forces have revived themselves, and now you're fighting against Pennsylvania and New Jersey at the same time. The federal government and the military structure of the federal government is just not enough to keep the people down in the United States, and that's really what he's alluding to. So to end this, Hamilton calls for the proportionality of the military with the resources of the country. As the community increases, the military will as well. So he states, and I quote, "We should recollect that the extent of the military force must at all events be regulated by the resources of the country. For a long time to come, it will not be possible to maintain a large army, and as the means of doing this increase, the population and natural strength of the community will proportionably increase." So as the population goes up, the extent of the military will be stronger, and the amount of revenue, the funding for the military will be much larger. So it'll increase the military structure. It'll also make it more powerful. And as the population goes up, but there should be some sort of proportionality to this. But as the natural strength of the community goes up, as in once they're making more money, there's more products being sold. We have a really enterprise, free market, consumer system set up, that apparatus. Once we have all that set up, you will see an increase in the extent of the military force. You will see it'll be proportional, as it's like a positive correlation. As the people's population goes up and the success goes up, so does the military in terms of numbers and funding. That's all he's saying there. So that's really it. That'll conclude this one. I'm pretty pumped up. Everyone stay tuned for Wednesday, because Wednesday's going to be a huge one. That's going to be the Second Amendment one, where he unequivocally, really, I think that one's a Madison. I'm pretty sure that's a Madison paper, but he pretty much unequivocally comes out adamantly. Oh no, that's a Hamilton paper as well. Actually, I don't know if that's a Hamilton paper. I gotta go look back into that. I could have swore that was a Madison paper, but maybe I'm wrong. So he unequivocally comes out and says that the people, the reason in which they have the right to bear arms is to fight against an oppressive government. He just says it outright. So anyone that tells you otherwise just doesn't know. They're unaware of the history. They're unaware of the views of the founding fathers at that time. So yeah, so I'm gonna go through with Federalist number 29 on Wednesday. So stay tuned for that. I humbly request everyone to check out the weekend special that just dropped this weekend, and that'll be it. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, drop the mic on people, let them know about the podcast. I will see everyone on Wednesday. I greatly appreciate you for tuning in. Thank you.